Hello everyone. For today, I would like you to sail with me to paradisiac islands, blue waters, tales of adventure and treasures. Because today I am going to tell you about the history of piracy in the Caribbean. So please sit down or lay down comfortably, put your headsets on. Our story is beginning right now. Most of the pirates we see in movies, like for example the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, are in fact from the beginning of the 18th century. And this is the end, the last years of piracy in the region. The story started long before this, about 200 years earlier, shortly after the first Spanish explorers discovered and started to colonize the Americas. After Christopher Columbus in 1492, more expeditions were sent to the Caribbean and Mexico. Ports were founded around the Caribbean Sea, such as Panama, Cartagena in today's Colombia, or Maracaibo in Venezuela and Santiago in Cuba. And the first ships carrying treasures, mainly gold and silver, coming from the Aztecs in Mexico, were sent back to Europe. They sailed back to Sevilla, the main city in the south of Spain that would remain for about 2 centuries the main trade gate between Europe and the Americas. And the first attacks on these ships started rather quickly. For example, in 1520, the first spectacular attack on Spanish ships took place when a French pirate crew captured 2 of the 3 ships that were bringing back to Europe the treasure of the last Aztec emperor Moctezuma. And very quickly, as Spain was at war with France and England, sometimes in the 16th century, the pirates were encouraged, supported by the kings of these countries. This is the difference between a pirate and a privateer. A pirate is an outlaw working for himself and trying to capture ships and their cargo, whereas a privateer is like a mercenary of the seas, working with the support, the legal backing of a country, and receiving the right to attack enemy ships, which makes his business more official. In fact, the distinction between the two was not that obvious, and we will see that many privateers during wartime did not want to stop their activity when peace came back and generally became pirates, whereas other time when pirates were impossible to control and to stop, they were hired by European powers to work for them. But the Spanish, who were during most of the history of piracy in the Caribbean the main victims of this activity, started to try and protect their ships, and by the middle of the 16th century, in the 1560s, they established a system of convoy between their colonial possessions in America and Sevilla in Spain. Every year, and once a year, this convoy called the Gold Fleet, La Flota de Oro, would leave Sevilla with colonists and equipment and reach the Americas, where 1 year of tribute in gold, but even more importantly, in the end of the 16th century and in the 17th century, the production of the silver mines in Central and South America. And this convoy, with the annual tribute, sailed back then to Spain. The convoy could be huge, more than 100 ships. It was escorted by warships, and this concentration of wealth was obviously very attractive for pirates, so that if any Spanish ship left the convoy from sight, it was immediately at risk of being attacked by pirates. The big problem the Spanish faced when they colonized America was the impossibility to control every island, to defend every sea lane between the Americas and Europe, because there were countless small islands in the Caribbean, and this is sometimes not taken enough into account, but European countries in the 16th, 17th centuries had a fairly limited population. For example, when the exploration of the world by the Portuguese and the Spanish started in the 16th century, there were just 2 million inhabitants in Portugal, which is nothing. This is like a big modern city, and that was for the entire country, which in majority was populated by peasants and fishermen, so that only a few thousand sailors and soldiers had to control a gigantic global empire made of various trade posts along the coast of Africa and in Asia. In Spain, you only had 8 million inhabitants, and here again a few, maybe tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers involved in the colonization of the world, so that the first cities were more like big villages in reality, and it was impossible to control tightly all of this territory and all of this sea that the kingdom was claiming. And pirates actually prospered on that during about 2 centuries. The impossibility for European powers with colonies in this region to clearly control everything, because the distances were huge, the communication problems were extremely complicated in this time, and the pirates could easily hit and disappear in this very complex geographic environment that the Caribbean is. And fairly quickly, other European powers like England, like France, like the Netherlands, that appeared as an independent country in the 16th century when they revolted against Spanish power in on their territory, started to be interested in colonizing the Caribbean, to install colonies in this region, or at least try to also benefit from the colonization of America by raiding on Spanish properties and Spanish ships in the Atlantic. The first move against Spain was made by France in the first half of the 16th century, as the two countries were at war, and various French privateers attacked and captured dozens of Spanish merchant ships. And in the second half of this century, it would mainly be England and the Netherlands, the United Provinces, as they were called, that supported this war effort on the seas, with privateers harassing Spanish convoys. In the 17th century, the Spanish realized that it would be extremely difficult for them to control every island in the Caribbean, and more or less accepted to abandon this part of the world, keeping essentially large islands such as Cuba or Santo Domingo, where you have the Dominican Republic today and Haiti, and they focused on the mainland, South and Central America, which allowed other European powers to start colonizing in this region. The first colonies there were the Bahamas and Jamaica for England. It was the islands of Martinique, Guadeloupe, or the western part of Santo Domingo for the French, that corresponds to Haiti today, and also islands were seized by the Dutch, and the game of piracy and privateering became more complex in the Caribbean, as in fact every war in Europe between these countries would be mirrored in this region by privateers hired by these European powers to attack enemy ships and convoys. In the 17th century, the quantity of wealth produced in the Caribbean grew a lot with the development of the plantation economy and the importation of slaves coming from Africa. Colonial products were produced in these islands of the Caribbean, sugar especially, but there were also plantations of tobacco, cotton, sometimes cocoa, and various other products, so that more opportunities appeared for pirates, but at the same time the economic damage to European countries became more important, and they started trying to organize things to fight piracy, and not only see it as a welcome source of harassment for Spain, against Spain. So that several treaties were signed between European countries, such as the Treaty of Madrid in 1670 between Spain and England, to legitimate everyone's possessions in the region and put an end to piracy. However, even privateers would not fully disappear until the 18th century, as every country was often at war with the others. There were constant wars, especially in the last second half of the 17th century, between France and England, France and the Netherlands and England, and these three countries against Spain too. And privateers and pirates benefited a lot from this. The golden age of piracy was probably the first 20 years of the 18th century, and now we are arriving to this period of the pirate movies, when all of Europe was at war during the War of the Succession of Spain, opposing France and Spain to most other European powers, and the Caribbean was one of the theaters of this war that ended after almost 15 years of fighting inconclusively and without any large change of frontiers and possessions in this region of the world, in the Americas. So, who were the pirates, and where did they come from? Most of them were coming initially from Europe, of course. They were mainly British and French, and to a lesser extent Dutch initially, but the crews also welcomed slaves that had escaped from the plantations where they worked, or outlaws from any European country or from the Spanish mainland, who were trying to escape judges or the justice of their country. And almost all the most famous pirates, like this Henry Morgan I mentioned earlier, or Blackbird, Rackham, Daniel Montbard, also known as the Exterminator, or l'Olonois, were actually adventurers born in Europe or in the plantations of the Caribbean, and they managed to make themselves captains of a crew which recognized their authority, and sometimes to even control several crews, several ships, organizing elaborate attacks against merchant ships, or sometimes even entire cities. There are various examples of French and British pirates, or filibusters, as they were sometimes called in the 17th century, organizing an attack against a city. Henry Morgan, for example, pillaged the city of Cartagena, or l'Olonois, who I mentioned earlier, pillaged and almost destroyed the cities of Maracaibo and Gibraltar in the south of Spain. Their strength was that they were unpredictable, and they could easily hide in the countless islands of the Caribbean, and sometimes there were so many of them that they could gather in pirate cities. I mentioned Port Royal before. Maybe Port Royal was in Jamaica, and the city as a pirate city only disappeared when the British, the English crown decided to award to Henry Morgan this status of governor of the island, so that he would straighten it out. And the other famous pirate lair was the island of Tortuga. Tortuga is not a legend, it did exist as a pirate island. It's an island off the coast of Haiti, where in the late 17th century, pirates from all nations on this territory that was officially a possession of France, but in fact it was not really controlled by France. The pirate ships could find a harbor, could find all the equipment and supply they needed for their operations, to the point that they could sometimes collaborate and organize raids together. These lairs would be destroyed one after the other, especially in the 18th century, when the European powers really started to find piracy more annoying than useful, and would make the necessary to expel the pirates from the Caribbean, forcing them to emigrate towards the Indian Ocean, where during a few more years they would benefit from an absence of control of the seas. But this is in this period, in the 1720s, that piracy really ended in the Caribbean. And one remarkable thing with piracy, especially in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, was that their organization, their society was somewhat democratic, at least much more than if they had worked for the navies of the countries they came from. Typically, one pirate remained free to leave the ship where he worked. That would have been totally impossible and forbidden and sentenced by death in the British or French Navy at the time. And when came the moment to share the treasures, typically the captain would receive 5 or 6 times more than the average pirate on the ship, but all of them would then have the same share of the treasure, with the youngest and less experienced having about half the share of the regular pirate. And one thing that made the pirates extremely dangerous and brave in a sense was that they knew most of the time that if they were captured, not only for being pirates but because of what they had done before, it's the death penalty that would await them, and they did not hesitate to attack much bigger ships by using generally smaller ships that could come quickly very close to the large and heavy galleons that the colonial powers were using to avoid the fire of their guns, and to attack the large ship by climbing to the bridge and forcing the enemy crew to quickly surrender. Piracy in the Caribbean had a last revival in the last years of the 18th century, during the wars of the French Revolution, when suddenly France lost control politically of its colonies in the region, and the war was raging between European countries, so that new pirate crews appeared, maybe up to 5,000 pirates at some point in the West Indies, and started attacking ships again. But this did not last very long, and in the 19th century piracy had totally disappeared. The ancient layers of pirates, like Jamaica, like the Bahamas, like Tortuga in Haiti, were under control, and piracy never came back. But in literature, in the imagination of Europeans and Americans, piracy in this period had a quite strong impact, and shortly after that pirates appeared as characters in novels. You probably know about the Treasure Island by Stevenson, but there were plenty of such novels in the 19th century, and the appeal of the pirates of the Caribbean continued until today, maybe because they represent liberty, even though they were thieves in reality, and they were sometimes particularly cruel and unreliable. But time has passed, and we see more the positive aspects. They were also opposed to tyrannic powers in a sense. So for us today, they represent liberty, they represent the first forms of self-organized democracy. They also represent a world where the color of your skin or your origin was not relevant in terms of assessing what you were worth. And this is something for the best that we consider a positive thing today. Thank you very much for your attention, and as usual, I hope you liked this presentation, which was just an introduction, and you know where to look for if you want to know more about this fascinating topic. Thank you, and see you soon. Bye bye.